The alarm woke me before the words did. By the time the lights in my cabin turned red, I was already pulling on my boots and the voice on the station speaker was shaking in a way I had never heard from a trained officer before. "Captain Voss to the command deck. Captain Voss, please." They crossed the line. They actually crossed the line. I ran. The corridors of Threshold Station were narrow, and I shoved past sleepy crew members who were only just understanding that something was wrong. My name is Alavas, and at that time I was a junior captain on the very edge of human space, in a small cluster of stars that most of the galaxy had never bothered to name. We were young. Humanity had only owned faster-than-light travel for 200 years. We held 12 systems, and we were proud of every single one of them. When I reached the command deck, my second officer, a steady young man named Daniel Carter, turned to me with a face the color of ash. "Look at the long-range feed," he said. "Tell me I'm reading it wrong. Please tell me I'm reading it wrong." I looked, and I felt my stomach drop through the floor. A fleet had entered the Proxima Verdant system. Not a small scout group, not a lost trader. A harvest fleet. 40 huge ships shaped like curved blades drifting toward our colony world with the slow confidence of something that had never once been told. No, I knew those ships. Every human on the frontier knew those ships. They belonged to the Corvathi Dominion, the oldest and largest empire any of us had ever heard about. 10 Usan systems, 3,000 years of history, a power so vast that they spoke about smaller species the way a farmer speaks about insects in a field, and Proxima Verdant was a human world. 40,000 of our people lived there. Farmers, teachers, children, families who had moved to the rim looking for open sky and cheap land. "Have they responded to any signal?" I asked. Daniel shook his head. "Nothing. We've sent the treaty codes 9 times. The border agreement is clear. Captain, this is our space. They have no right to be here." I gripped the back of his chair to keep my hands from shaking. "Open a direct channel to their lead ship now." It took a moment. Then a face appeared on our screen, and I will remember it for the rest of my life. The Corvathi commander had gray skin pulled tight over a long skull and eyes set deep like dark stones. When it spoke, the translation came through flat and bored, as if answering us was a chore beneath its dignity. "You are transmitting on a restricted channel," it said. "Cease at once." I forced my voice to stay level. "This is Captain Alar Voss of the Human Frontier. You have entered Proxima Verdant. This system is protected under the border treaty signed by your own dominion. You must withdraw immediately." The commander studied me the way you might study a stain on a clean table. "The treaty you speak of applies to recognized species. It said your kind does not meet the threshold for protected status. The lower council reviewed your case and found you wanting. You are not a people. You are a resource. The world below contains useful biological material. We are here to collect it." For a second, I could not speak. The words were so cold, so final, that my mind refused to hold them. "There are 40,000 living people on that world." I said yes. The commander replied as if I had confirmed something helpful. "A modest yield. Remain where you are and you will not be harmed. Interfere and you will be removed." This conversation is finished. The channel closed. I had 2 ships at Threshold Station. 2 old patrol cutters with weapons meant for chasing smugglers. The Corvathi had 40 warships, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built. I knew the numbers. Every officer on that deck knew the numbers, and every one of them turned to look at me, waiting to hear what I would say. The honest answer, the answer that training and survival both demanded, was that there was nothing we could do. To launch would be to die without changing a single thing. The right military decision was to record everything, send the data home, and live to fight another day. I gave that order. I hated myself for it, but I gave it. "Carter, prepare a full recording package. Every signal, every image, every word that thing just said to us, encrypt it, and send it to Earth on the fastest courier we have. The whole human government is going to see this." Daniel's hands moved across his panel, but his eyes stayed on me and the colony captain. I made myself watch the screen. The harvest ships were spreading out above Proxima Verdant, now lowering long collection arms toward the surface like the legs of some patient insect. On the colony channel, voices were rising. People were asking what was happening. People were asking for help. A man's voice broke through, calling for anyone at all, to answer. I have given many hard orders in my life since that day. Nothing has ever been harder than the silence I held in that moment. We watch, I said quietly. We watch, and we remember every name. There was a moment, an hour into it, when I nearly broke my own order. A young pilot named Leo Ward stood up from his station with tears running down his face and asked me to let him launch. Just him, just his single fighter, just one run at the nearest harvest ship. I can reach it before they react, he said. I know I can. I can't sit here and do nothing while that happens, Captain. I can't, please. I looked at him, and I understood him completely, because every part of me wanted exactly the same thing. To launch was to feel like a person again instead of a helpless witness. To launch was to do something. Sit down, Leo, I said, and I made my voice as gentle as I could, while still leaving no room for argument. If you launch, you die, and that ship keeps working. And the only thing that changes is that the people we love will never learn your name either. I need you alive. Earth needs you alive. The people down there need someone to remember them, and dead men remember nothing. Sit down. He sat. He hated me for it in that moment, and I let him because hatred was easier for him to carry than helplessness, and a young man needed something to carry. Years later, after the war, Leo Ward found me and thanked me for that order. He had a family by then, children of his own. He told me he thought about that hour every day. So did I. So we did. For 6 hours we recorded everything. We could not save them, but we refused to let them be erased. We logged the colony registry, all 40,000 entries, family by family. We saved the last messages people sent up to us, the goodbyes, the questions, the small brave jokes from people who did not fully understand what was coming. A school teacher named Grace Bell sent us her class list and asked us to make sure the children's names were not forgotten. A young father held his daughter up to a camera so that, in his words, somebody out there will know she was real. By the time the Corvathi fleet finished and turned to leave, Proxima Verdant was empty. The world still spun green and blue and beautiful, but every human voice on it had gone quiet. The harvest ships did not even slow down as they passed our station. They simply moved on, back across our border and out of our space, the way a person walks away from a field they have finished clearing. The Corvathi commander sent one last message before it jumped away. It was not meant as a threat. It was worse than a threat. It was a note for the records, polite and clerical. Collection complete. Yield acceptable. Recommend this region be scheduled for regular harvest. The local population offers no resistance of note. Then they were gone. I sat down in my chair. The command deck was silent, except for the hum of the machines. Daniel was crying quietly, trying to hide it. My hands had finally stopped shaking, and that frightened me more than the shaking had, because what replaced it was something cold and steady and entirely new. I looked at the recording of the empty world. I looked at the list of 40,000 names, and I thought about the words that creature had used, not a people, a resource, no resistance of note. They believed the treaty was just paper. They believed our border was a courtesy they could ignore whenever they were hungry. They believed we were small and slow and beneath their notice. I understood in that moment that they had made a mistake, not the mistake of cruelty, though they were cruel. A different mistake, a mistake of arithmetic. They had looked at 12 human systems and 200 years of history and decided they had measured us completely. They had decided they knew exactly what we were and exactly what we could do. They had no idea. Daniel, I said. My voice did not sound like my own. It sounded like the cold thing that had settled into my chest. Add one more line to the package we're sending Earth. After the recordings, after the names, he wiped his face and looked up. What line, Captain? I watched the empty green world turn slowly on the screen. Tell them this, I said. The Corvathi think our treaties are paper. We thought they were promises. That was their first mistake, assuming those two things were the same. Tell Earth the rim is awake now and tell them to start building. Daniel typed it word for word. Then he sent it, and the courier ship leapt away toward home, carrying the truth of what had happened to the very edge of human space. I stayed on the deck long after my shift ended. I did not want to sleep. I was afraid that if I slept, the cold steadiness inside me might fade. And I needed it. I needed all of it. I had a feeling even then, standing in that quiet room above a stolen world, that I was going to need it for a very long time. Somewhere far away, the Corvathi commander was already filing its report, already forgetting our faces, already thinking about the next field to clear. It went to sleep that night, certain that it had taught a small and harmless species to stay quiet. It was right about the quiet. We did go quiet. All of us, every human world. For a long time after that day, it was wrong about what the quiet meant. The school teacher had asked me to remember the names of her children. I did. I remember them still. And when the day finally came that the Corvathi Dominion learned exactly what kind of species they had decided to harvest, I made certain that the world they would always associate with their first true defeat carried only one name: Verdant. We were going to make them learn it. The silence after Proxima Verdant lasted 18 months, and the Corvathi mistook it for surrender. That was the most expensive misunderstanding in the history of their empire. I was called home to Earth within a week of sending my report. I expected a quiet review, perhaps a reprimand for not throwing my two old cutters into a battle I could not win. Instead, I walked into a sealed chamber beneath the old defense headquarters and found nearly every senior commander humanity had sitting around a long table, watching my recording from Threshold Station play on a wall the size of a building. When it finished, when the last name on Grace Bell's class list faded from the screen, the room was completely silent. An older woman at the head of the table turned to look at me. Her name was Admiral Ruth Caldwell, and she had spent 40 years keeping the peace between Earth's old nations. She had a reputation for being calm in a way that made other people nervous. "Captain Voss," she said, "you watched this happen, and you did not fire." "Yes, ma'am. Some people are calling that cowardice. They can call it whatever they like. Ma'am, if I had fired, my crews would be dead, my station would be gone, and you would have a rumor instead of a recording. You needed to see their faces. You needed to hear them call us a resource that was worth more than 2 cutters." Admiral Caldwell studied me for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. "It was," she agreed. "Sit down, Captain. We have a great deal to discuss, and not nearly enough time." What happened over the next 18 months is the part of the story the galaxy still cannot understand even now. They cannot understand how a young species scattered across 12 modest systems became something that could frighten an empire of 10,000 worlds. They look for a secret weapon, some hidden technology, some lucky discovery. They never find one because there wasn't one. The secret was simpler than that, and far more uncomfortable for them to admit. Every other species in the galaxy had risen on gentle worlds. Their planets were kind, food was easy, predators were few, and the weather rarely tried to kill them. They developed intelligence, and then they developed cooperation, and they skipped almost entirely the long, brutal school that taught a species how to truly fight. When they finally reached the stars and met one another, conflicts were short and rare, settled by displays of strength rather than real struggle. The Corvathi were the strongest of them all simply because they were willing to be a little crueler than anyone else. And 3,000 years of no one standing up to them had convinced them that strength and cruelty were the same thing. Humanity grew up differently. Our homeworld tried to kill us from the very first day. Earth gave us ice ages and droughts, plagues and predators, floods and famines. And when the planet ran out of ways to threaten us, we turned and threatened each other. For all of our history, before we ever reached space, humans fought humans. We did terrible things to one another. But in the doing of those terrible things, we learned we turned conflict into a science. We studied it the way other species studied music or mathematics. Deception, supply, patience, sacrifice, the willingness to lose a piece to win the board. No other species in the galaxy had ever needed to learn these things. We had spent 10,000 years learning nothing else. The Corvathi looked at our small territory and saw a weak people. What they could not see, because nothing in their history had prepared them to see it, was that they had quietly woken up the single most experienced predator the galaxy had ever produced. And for the first time in all of human history, that predator was not divided against itself. That was the true miracle of those 18 months, not the shipyards, though the shipyards were astonishing. The miracle was that the old rivalries simply dissolved. Nations that had argued for centuries stopped arguing in a single week. There were no long debates, no political games. Admiral Caldwell put the recording from Proxima Verdant in front of every government on Earth and in every colony. And after they watched it, there was nothing left to argue about. A man named Owen Hart, who had spent his career running the largest civilian shipping company in human space, walked into the defense headquarters and offered his entire fleet of freighters and every shipyard he owned, asking for nothing in return except a place in the line. "My grandmother lived on Proxima Verdant," he told Caldwell. "I want to help build whatever it is you're building." We retold freighter yards to build warships in a matter of weeks. We took mining vessels and turned them into something new. The first ships we built were ugly. I want to be honest about that. They were not the gleaming warships of a great power. They were freyers with teeth, mining haulers with armor bolted on, civilian hulls pressed into a purpose they had never been designed for. A visiting Corvathi officer would have laughed at them. That was rather the point. We did not need ships that looked frightening. We needed ships that worked, and that we could build faster than anyone believed possible, and that an enemy would underestimate right up until the moment it was too late to matter. The early training was a disaster, and I am glad of it now because every failure in those quiet months was a life saved later. The first time we ran a full fleet exercise, 3 of our crews collided in formation, because the captains were still thinking like the peacetime officers they had always been. The second time, an entire squadron charged a simulated enemy head-on, the brave and honest way, and was taken apart in minutes by an opponent that simply refused to fight fair. I sat with those crews afterward, and made them watch the recording of their own defeat over and over until the lesson sank past their pride and into their bones. "Stop trying to be honorable," I told them. "Honor is a luxury for people who can afford to lose. The Corvathi have honor too in their way, and they will use yours against you. We do not fight the battle the enemy wants. We do not stand where they expect us to stand. We make them chase. We make them guess. We make them spend 10 ships to corner one of ours, and then we are not there when they arrive. If that offends you, find another fleet. If it makes sense to you, then you might live long enough to see your home again." By the 3rd month, the crews had changed. By the 6th, they had become something the galaxy had never produced. An entire fighting force trained from the ground up to win ugly, to win patient, to win in ways that no gentle species had ever imagined a war could be won. And while the engineers worked, and the crews learned, the planners planned, and I found myself in those planning rooms more often than not. Because I was the only senior officer who had stood and watched the Corvathi work, who had heard them speak, who knew in my bones how they thought. They fight short wars, I told the room again and again. Overwhelming force, quick collection, home before dinner. They have never fought a long war because no one has ever made them. They have no patience because patience has never been required. So we give them a long war. We give them the one thing their entire history has never taught them to survive. Admiral Caldwell promoted me during that time, lifting me out of frontier patrol and placing me in command of a new fleet built around ideas the galaxy had never seen used in space. Not bigger guns, not thicker armor tricks, patience, the willingness to take a blow in order to land one. We trained crews to do things no Corvathi commander would ever expect, because no enemy had ever dared try them. I remember the night she told me. She called me into her office late and poured 2 glasses of something strong and slid one across the desk to me. "There are officers above you who think you are too young for this," she said bluntly. There are officers who think you froze at Proxima Verdant. I am giving you the fleet anyway. Do you know why? No, ma'am. Because every other commander I have wants to fight the Corvathi, the way they fight each other bravely. Honestly, face to face. She studied me over her glass. You are the only one who watched them and came back wanting to fight them the way you would fight something that means to eat you. That is what we need, not bravery. We have plenty of bravery, and it will get us all removed. We need someone who is willing to be feared. She set down her glass. Can you be feared? Not just by them, by our own people who will not always understand what you are doing or why. Can you carry that? I thought about a green world falling silent and a teacher's class list and the cold, steady thing that had settled into my chest and never left. Yes, ma'am, I said. I can carry it. Good, she said, because no one else will thank you for it. Go and win. And the whole time the Corvathi did nothing. They were not even watching us. Why would they watch a field they had already cleared once? In their records, we were a scheduled resource, nothing more. They were so certain of this that when they finally decided to remind us of our place, they did not send a war fleet. They sent a punitive squadron, 30 ships. A small slap meant to teach a lesson, meant to remind the insects to stay still while they were being collected. The orders we later recovered described it as a routine correction of an underperforming territory. The squadron crossed into human space at a system called Howard's Reach, a quiet place with a single gas giant and no colonies. They expected to find frightened patrol ships or nothing at all. They expected to fire a few shots, transmit a warning, and leave. I was waiting for them. I had chosen Howard's Reach myself months earlier on a map with a cup of cold coffee in my hand. The gas giant had enormous storm bands, towering walls of cloud and lightning that scrambled sensors and swallowed ships whole. To a Corvathi commander, it was a hazard to be avoided. To me, it was the largest place to hide a fleet in the entire region. We had been there for 3 days when they arrived. 3 days of waiting in the dark with our engines cold is a long time. The crews grew quiet and tense, the way people do before something they cannot take back. I walked the decks each shift, not to inspect anything, but simply to let them see me calm because a crew takes its temperature from its commander, and I could not afford to let them feel my own fear. My ship sat deep inside those storms, engines cold, signals silent, while I watched the enemy squadron enter the system on a long-range feed that the storm let through only in thin, careful bursts. Beside me, on the command deck of my flagship, stood my new second officer, a sharp young woman named Maya Foster, who had been a competition strategist before she ever wore a uniform. She watched the enemy advance with the calm focus of someone reading the early moves of a game she already knew how to win. "They're slowing," she said. "They found the minefield. We had seeded the obviousest approach, the clear lane any sensible commander would use with thousands of small charges, not enough to destroy 30 warships. That was never the point. The point was to make them stop, to make them turn, to make them choose a different path. A herd does not need a wall on every side. It only needs a wall on the wrong sides." "They're turning toward the secondary lane," Maya confirmed. "Just like you said they would. And the decoys." She almost smiled. "Reading our decoy fleet now. 3 of them, actually. They think they found us. All 3. They can't decide which one is real, so they're splitting their formation to engage all 3 at once." I watched the enemy squadron break apart on the feed, dividing its strength 3 ways to chase ghosts we had built out of empty hulls and false signals. 30 ships, confident and disciplined, scattering themselves across the system to hunt fleets that did not exist, while the storm bands of the gas giant hid the only fleet that did. I let them commit. I let them spread until they could not easily come back together. It was the hardest waiting of my life to that point. Harder than the storm, harder than the 3 days. Every instinct screamed at me to strike while I had surprise, but surprise spent too early. Is surprise wasted? Maya watched the enemy formation stretch thinner and thinner across the system. And I watched her watch it. And neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left to say until the moment was perfect. And then, when the moment was exactly right, when the last of them had turned away from us to chase a phantom, I gave the order I had been holding for 18 months. All ships, I said, full power. Bring us out of the storm. We came out of those clouds like something the galaxy had never imagined. The Corvati squadron was scattered, divided, looking the wrong way. Certain they were the hunters. They had no formation. They had no support. They had only their certainty. And their certainty was about to fail them completely. I will not describe the battle in detail. It was not in truth much of a battle. A battle requires two sides who both have a chance. What happened at Howard's Reach was the result of 18 months of human patience meeting an enemy who had never once in 3,000 years been required to be careful. We took them apart piece by piece, ship by isolated ship, never giving them the chance to reunite, never letting them find a target that was truly there until it was already too late. We lost 2 ships. They lost 30 when it was over. One Corvati vessel remained drifting and damaged, its commander finally understanding far too late what had been done to it. I could have finished it. Maya looked at me waiting for the order. I did not give it. Open a channel, I said instead to the survivor and to whatever command structure they report to. I want this heard all the way up their chain. The channel opened. I did not make a speech. I had learned watching. That gray commander above Proxima Verdant that the cruelest thing you can do to an arrogant enemy is to be brief. I let them see my fleet whole and waiting. Sitting in the wreckage of their squadron, I let them count their own dead. And then I sent them a single word. The only word I felt they had earned more. Then I closed the channel and let the one survivor crawl home to deliver it. I have been asked many times since why I let that single ship go, when destroying it would have been simple. The answer is that a defeat no one survives to report is not a defeat. It is a mystery, and mysteries can be explained away, dismissed as accidents, buried by a proud command that does not wish to believe them. I did not want the Corvi to wonder what had happened to their squadron. I wanted them to know in precise and humiliating detail, and I wanted that knowing be carried home by one of their own, in their own words, so that it could not be denied. A survivor is a weapon. I had learned that lesson watching their commander spare my station above Proxima Verdant, certain that our survival would only teach us fear. He had been wrong about what our survival would teach us. I did not intend to make the same mistake about theirs. That message reached the heart of the Dominion within the week. I have read the records since. I know what it did to them. For the first time in 3,000 years, a report crossed a Corvati commander's desk that did not make sense. A scheduled resource had refused to be collected. A field had stood up and removed the harvesters from it. 30 ships gone against an enemy they had counted at 12 poor systems and 2 centuries of nothing. They did what arrogant powers always do when reality first contradicts them. They decided it was a mistake, an error, an unlucky accident that proper force would correct. They could not yet accept the truth because accepting it would mean admitting they had been wrong about everything. And an empire of 3,000 years does not know how to do that. So they committed properly. They gathered a real fleet, a war fleet, and they came for us in earnest. That was exactly what I had been waiting for. Because a punitive squadron can be a mistake. A war fleet is a commitment. And a commitment from an enemy who has never learned patience is a thread you can pull until the whole garment comes apart. We had made the monster bleed once. Now we were going to teach it to fear. The war that followed was nothing like the war the Corvati prepared for. And that was the entire point. They came at us the way they had crushed every enemy for 3,000 years, with overwhelming force, aimed at a single decisive battle. Their doctrine was simple and against every other species. Perfect. Gather a fleet so large that resistance is pointless. Find the enemy's main force, destroy it in one crushing blow, except surrender. Go home. They had done this hundreds of times. It had never once failed. So they searched for our main fleet, our grand armada, the great force. They assumed we must be hiding so they could destroy it and end the war in a single afternoon. They never found it. They never found it because it did not exist. We did not build one great fleet for them to break. We built many small ones, fast and scattered. And we used them to do the one thing the Korvathi had no answer for. We refused to give them their decisive battle. We refused to stand in one place and fight the war they wanted. Instead, we bled them everywhere, all at once, and never where they were looking. I commanded from a ship that rarely stayed in the same system for more than a day. Maya Foster ran my operations board. And over those long middle years, she and I developed a kind of short orthand, able to redraw an entire campaign with a few words across a quiet deck. We did not aim at their warships. We aimed at the things their warships needed: fuel depots, supply convoys, repair stations, communication relays, the unglamorous, unprotected veins through which an empire's strength actually flows. The Korvathi had never needed to protect these things because no enemy had ever lived long enough to threaten them. Their supply line stretched across the stars, fat and slow and completely undefended. And we fell upon them like wolves on a herd that had never seen a wolf. A war fleet is a terrifying thing. A war fleet with no fuel and no spare parts is a collection of very expensive metal drifting in the dark. I remember one raid in particular early in those middle years that taught me how completely the enemy failed to understand us. We had learned of a great fuel depot at a system called Morin's Cross undefended because the Korvathi could not imagine it being reached. We did not attack it. Maya pointed out that an attack depot is replaced, but a poisoned one becomes a lesson. So instead of destroying it, we took it quietly in the dark, and we tampered with the fuel itself in ways their engineers would not detect until it was already aboard their ships. For 2 months afterward, Korvathi vessels across the entire region suffered engine failures their own technicians could not explain. And they grounded half their fleet out of a fear they could not name. We had not fired a shot. We had simply made them afraid of their own fuel. That was the kind of war we fought, and they had no doctrine for any of it. They sent 400 warships to the front. Maya told me one evening, perhaps a year into the campaign, she had a way of delivering bad news for the enemy with great satisfaction. And they've spent the last 3 months learning that 400 warships need an ocean of fuel that has to come from somewhere. We've cut that somewhere into pieces. Half their fleet is sitting at Tarsan Gate right now, unable to move, waiting for supplies that are never going to arrive. I looked at the map. She was right. The greatest concentration of Korvathi force in the region was stranded, immobile, slowly starving. Not because we had defeated it in battle, but because we had quietly removed the ground from beneath its feet. But I want to be honest about those years because it would be a lie to pretend they were easy, or clever, or clean. They were not. They were long, and they were hard, and they cost us more than I can put into words. The Korvathi command in those years began to come apart in a way we could see in their own intercepted orders. Commanders who lost ships were replaced. And their replacements lost ships too, and were replaced in turn. And each new officer arrived more frightened and more confused than the last. They could not report the truth to their own capital because the truth was unbelievable, and careers ended on unbelievable reports. So they lied upward, each layer softening the disaster for the layer above, until the leadership at the heart of the Dominion was receiving a picture of the war that bore no resemblance to the one their soldiers were actually losing. An empire that cannot bear to hear bad news will eventually be destroyed by the bad news it refused to hear. We did not have to break their command. We only had to make the truth painful enough that they broke it themselves by refusing to look at it. The Korvathi were arrogant, but they were not stupid. And an arrogant enemy who begins to feel pain becomes a different kind of dangerous. As they learned what we were doing, they adapted. They began to escort their convoys. They began to fortify their depots. And they began slowly to understand that we would trade blood for advantage in ways no other species ever had. That understanding cost me a great deal. There was a man I have not yet spoken of, the officer who taught me almost everything I knew about command. His name was Captain Henry Wells, And he had been my instructor when I was young and foolish and certain I knew everything. He was old enough to have retired twice and stubborn enough to refuse both times. When the war came, he took command of one of our raiding groups, and there was no one in the fleet I trusted more. I spoke with him the night before the operation, that would take his life, though, of course, neither of us knew it. And we talked over a poor connection across two systems the way old friends do about nothing important. He told me I was working too hard. I told him he was too old to be leading raids. He laughed at that. I've been too old for everything for 20 years. Ara, he said, it's never stopped me yet. You know what? I keep thinking about that recording you sent home. The teacher in her class list, Grace Bell. I memorized those names. You know, all of them. Couldn't help it. He was quiet for a moment. When this is over, when you finished it, I want you to do something for me. I want you to make sure those children meant something. That's all. Not that we won, that they mattered. You can make sure of it yourself, I told him. When this is over, of course, he said in the easy way that I have since realized was the way he had always lied to spare me. When this is over, that was the last real conversation we ever had. At a place called Cinder Reach, the Corvathi finally set a trap of their own, and they set it well. They let us believe a major depot was lightly defended. They let us commit to the strike, and when our ships arrived, they closed a circle around us that we had not seen forming. I was not there. I have been grateful and ashamed of that fact in equal measure ever since. I commanded the wider campaign from 2 systems away, and I could only watch the reports come in as the trap closed. Henry Wells was inside it. He could have run. There was a path out, narrow and costly, and a younger commander might have taken it and saved most of his ships. Henry did not take it. He understood the way only an old soldier can, that if his group ran, the Corvathi would chase, and the chase would carry them straight into a second larger force of ours that was not yet ready to fight. So he did not run. He turned his group around, and he held the line at Cinder Reach, and he held it long enough for the rest of us to pull back and reform. The cost of holding that line was everything. We lost 60,000 people at Cinder Reach. We lost Henry Wells. The last message I received from him was short the way he always was. Hold the rim. He wrote, finish what you started. Don't you dare waste this. Then his signal went dark, and Cinder Reach was a victory. And I have never in my life hated a victory more. I want to tell you that I took that loss like a stone wall, that I absorbed it and pressed on. That would be a lie, too. There was a stretch of days after Cinder Reach when I wanted to stop. Not because I doubted we could win. By then, I knew we could win. I wanted to stop because the price of winning had a face now, and the face belonged to the man who had taught me how to fight. I sat alone in my quarters, and I read Henry's last message until the words stopped meaning anything. And I asked myself whether any border, any treaty, any promise was worth 60,000 people and an old man who deserved a quiet retirement. What I did not yet understand in those dark days was what the war was doing to the people back home. I had thought of the home worlds as something I was protecting from a distance, something soft and safe behind the line my fleet was holding. I was wrong. Every human world had changed. The same refusal to be divided that had united Earth's old nations had spread into every street and every home. Children learned the names of the lost colonies in school. Workers who had never met a soldier built ships through the night and asked for no extra pay. When the casualty lists from Cinder Reach reached the homeworlds, there were no riots, no demands to surrender, no cries to make peace at any price. There was only a quiet, terrible resolve. The resolve of an entire species that had looked at what was done to Proxima Verdant and decided all at once, and without needing to be told, that it would rather pay any price than ever be a field to be cleared again. When I learned how the homeworlds had answered Cinder Reach, my own doubt began to feel like a betrayal of theirs, and I started slowly to climb back out of the dark. It was Maya who finished pulling me out. She did not tell me to be strong. She did not give me a speech. She simply sat down across from me and put a data slate on the table between us. You should see this before you decide anything, she said quietly. The slate held a Korvathi command order, intercepted that morning. I read it, and the cold steadiness that had first found me above. Proxima Verdant came flooding back stronger than ever. The Korvathi were beginning to feel the war turning against them, and they did not understand why. And that lack of understanding had made them frightened, and their fear had made them vicious. There was a small, peaceful species called the Velni, a gentle trading people who held a single quiet world and had taken no side in the war. Their only crime was that somewhere along the way, a few of their merchant ships had traded fuel and supplies with us. Quietly for profit, the way merchants everywhere have always done. The Korvathi had discovered this, and the order on Maya's slate was an instruction to make an example of the Veli homeworld, to remove it, to turn it into a warning to anyone else who might think of helping the strange small species that was causing the Dominion. Such embarrassment. I read the order twice. Then I stood up and I was not tired anymore. When I asked, the order goes into effect in 2 days. Maya said, we can't reach the Veli world in time. It's too deep in their space. There's nothing we can do to stop it. She was right. We could not stop it. And the Korvathi carried it out exactly as their order described. And a peaceful world that had wanted nothing but to be left alone went silent, because a few of its merchants had once sold us fuel. The Korvathi believed this would teach the galaxy to stay away from us. It was perhaps the single greatest mistake they made in the entire war, larger even than the mistake they had made above Proxima Verdant because the galaxy was watching. The galaxy had always been watching, and what the galaxy saw was not a lesson about the danger of helping humans. What the galaxy saw was the truth about the Korvathi dominion laid bare at last, stripped of 3,000 years of careful image. For 3,000 years, the smaller species of the galaxy had obeyed the Korvathi out of fear, and they had told themselves a comfortable story to make that fear bearable. They had told themselves that the Korvathi was strong but fair, harsh but rational, an empire you could survive if you simply followed the rules and kept your head down. The Velni had followed the rules. The Veli had kept their heads down, and the Korvathi had removed them anyway for nothing out of fear and spite in front of the entire galaxy. The comfortable story died that day, and in its place came a question that the smaller species had never dared to ask before. A question that the war had finally made it possible to ask. What if the monster could be beaten? They began to come to us quietly. A message here, an offer there. A minor power that controlled a stretch of useful space, opening its ports to our ships under the cover of darkness. A trading league that had suffered under Korvathi rule for centuries, slipping us intelligence about supply routes and fleet movements. A ship-building species that had been forced to build vessels for the Dominion for generations, suddenly finding ways to build for us instead. The first of them to come in person was an elder of a quiet species called the Sithari, a people who had bowed to the Korvathi for 1,000 years. Their representative was old, even by their long-lived standards, and she came to my flagship under heavy secrecy, terrified the whole time that the Korvathi would learn of it. She did not offer warmth. She did not pretend to love us. She set a data archive on the table between us, a complete map of Korvathi supply movements across 100 systems, gathered patiently over decades by a people who had been forced to manage those very supplies. We kept these records hoping that one day someone would come who could use them, she told me through her translator. We had begun to believe no one ever would. We had begun to believe the Korvathi were simply the shape of the universe, and that hope was a kind of foolishness. She looked at me with eyes that had seen 1,000 years of submission. You made the universe a different shape. We do not know yet whether you are better than them, but you are different, and after 1,000 years different is enough to gamble everything on. Use our records well. Human, do not make us regret this. I have never forgotten her, or the weight of what her people risked by trusting us. Maya brought me each new offer with a growing list, and one evening she set the full tally in front of me and shook her head in something close to wonder. They're lining up, she said. Powers that have been afraid of the Korvath since before humans learned to write. They're all quietly coming to our side. Why now? We've been winning for a year. Why is it happening all at once now? I thought about about Henry Wells, and about a school teacher named Grace Bell, who had asked me to remember the names of her children. They're not coming because they love us, I said. Let's not fool ourselves about that. Half of them think we're nearly as frightening as the Corvathi. And they're not entirely wrong. They're coming because for the first time in 3,000 years, somebody is making the monster bleed. And the monster is panicking. And they've finally seen what it really is when it's afraid. I looked at the long list of names on her slate. They're not joining a friend, Maya. They're joining a winner. And right now, that's enough. The war had changed. It was no longer 12 human systems against 10,000 Corvathi worlds. It was an empire of fear against everyone that Empire had ever frightened. And the dam that fear had built was finally beginning to crack. But I knew something the new allies did not yet understand. Cracking the dam was not enough. We could bleed the Corvathi for 100 years and still not break them because their empire was vast beyond imagining. And you cannot conquer 10,000 worlds with raids and clever tricks. To truly end this, to make certain, the Corvathi could never again look at a smaller species and see a field to be cleared, we would have to do something no one had ever done. We would have to make them afraid in the one place they had always believed themselves safe. We would have to go to the heart. The plan I brought to Admiral Caldwell had a name. We called it Long Memory, and when I first explained it, the room went so quiet that I could hear the air systems humming in the walls. You want to strike Corvith Prime? Caldwell said slowly. Their capital, the throne world itself. Yes, ma'am. It is the most defended place in the galaxy. It sits at the center of 10,000 systems. To reach it, a fleet would have to cross the entire Dominion through every defensive line they have ever built. It cannot be done. They have spent 3,000 years making certain it cannot be done. They've spent 3,000 years making certain it can't be done. Obvious way, I said. Through the front door, through the main lanes, past the great fortress systems against the bulk of their fleet. And they're right. That can't be done. So we're not going to do that. I brought up a map then, a map that had cost us a great deal to make. Drawn from intelligence our new allies had risked everything to gather, and from charts our own scout ships had filled in during the long, quiet months, when the Corvathi thought we were simply hiding. There's another way to the heart, I said. Not through their space, through the dark between it. The empty regions the Corvathi never charted because they never imagined anyone would be patient enough or desperate enough to use them. Dark space. No stars, no supply, no help, no way back if anything goes wrong. The Corvathi call those routes impassable. They've called them impassable for so long that they've stopped guarding the places where those routes come out, because in their minds, nothing can come from there. Maya, standing beside me, added the part that made it real. We've already charted the way quietly over the last year while they thought our scouts were just running from their patrols. We mapped a path through the dark all the way to the Corvus system. It's narrow. It's dangerous. We'll be cut off from everything the entire way, but it's there. And at the end of it is a back door into the center of their empire that they have completely forgotten exists. Admiral Caldwell looked at the map for a long time. She was a woman, and she's understood exactly how much we were proposing to risk. A fleet sent through dark space could not be supported, could not be reinforced, could not retreat. If anything went wrong, if we were caught, if the route failed, those ships and everyone aboard them would simply vanish far from home, beyond any help. How many ships? She asked at last. Enough to threaten the capital, I said. Not enough to conquer it. We won't be there to conquer, ma'am. We'll be there to make a point. And to make it, I only need to arrive. She was silent for another long moment. Then she looked up at me, and there was something in her eyes that I had not seen before. A mix of fear and fierce hope. Henry Wells told me once that you were the best student he ever had, she said quietly. And the most dangerous. He said you understood something about war that frightened him. I think I finally know what he meant. She stood. Take your fleet, Admiral Voss. Go to the heart, end this, and come home if you can." We left without ceremony. A fleet does not announce that it is about to do the impossible. We simply slipped out of human space one quiet night and turned toward the dark. And then the stars thinned out around us. And then there were no stars at all. I cannot fully describe what those weeks in dark space were like. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from being truly completely alone. From knowing that every world you have ever loved is impossibly far away, and that there is no force in the universe that could reach you in time, if play. Anything went wrong. The crews felt it. I felt it. We moved through a blackness so total that our ships seemed to be the only real things in all of creation. A small string of lights crossing an emptiness that did not know or care that we existed. I made a decision before we entered the dark that I have never regretted. I told every crew member before we lost sight of the last star exactly where we were going and exactly what we intended to do. Some commanders would have kept it secret until the final moment, fearing that the knowledge would frighten the crews into mistakes. I did the opposite. I wanted them to carry the purpose of it through the worst of the journey. To know in the loneliest hours that they were not simply lost in the dark, but were crossing it on purpose towards something that mattered. For a teacher's class list and a peaceful world, and an old man who had told me to finish what I started, a frightened crew with a reason can endure almost anything. It is purpose, not courage, that carries people through the dark, and I made certain every one of them had it. Maya kept the fleet steady through navigation that would have broken a less disciplined crew. There were no landmarks in the dark, no stars to steer by. We followed our charts and our instruments and a great deal of faith, and every day we did not become lost was a small private victory that we did not dare to celebrate out loud. There was a crisis in the middle of the crossing that I have never spoken about until now. On the 17th day, our lead navigation ship lost its bearings completely. A sensor fault. The kind of small failure that means nothing in normal space and means death. In the dark for 9 hours, we did not know if we were still on our charted path or drifting blind toward an emptiness from which we would never return. The crews felt it. Word spreads on a ship no matter how you try to contain it. And I could see the fear settling over my people like a cold fog. The fear that we had gambled everything and lost. That we would simply vanish out here unmourned. Our families never knowing what became of us. I did the only thing a commander can do in such a moment. I went on every channel in the fleet, and I did not lie to them because they would have known. I told them the truth that we were temporarily without our bearings, and that we were going to find them again because the alternative was unacceptable, and so we would simply refuse it. And then Maya, who had not slept in 2 days, did something extraordinary. She rebuilt our position by hand, using the faint background patterns of the distant galaxy itself. The way the oldest sailors of Earth once found their way home by the stars when all their instruments failed. It took her 9 hours. When she finally looked up and said quietly that she had found us, that we were still on the path, I watched the fear lift off 3,000 crew members all at once. And I understood that we would reach the heart of the enemy because a people who could do what Maya had just done could do anything at all. And then after weeks that felt like years, Maya looked up from her board with an expression I will never forget. "Stars ahead," she said softly. "We're coming out, Ela. We're coming out exactly where the charts said we would." She checked her readings twice, 3 times, as if she could not quite believe them. "We're in the Corvette system. We are in their home system, and there is nothing between us and the throne world. We came out of the dark into the brilliant light of the Corvathi capital system. And for one perfect impossible moment, nothing happened. The defenses that ringed Corvith Prime were all turned outward toward the main lanes, toward the obvious approaches, toward the front door they had guarded for 3,000 years. None of them were looking behind into the dark, because nothing had ever come from the dark. We did. By the time their senses understood what they were seeing, by the time the alarms began to sound across the throne world, we were already past the outer defenses, already driving inward, already a human fleet in the sky of the Corvathi capital. The panic in their signals was a thing I could feel, even through the cold language of intercepted transmissions. It was the panic of a power that had believed with absolute certainty that this could never happen, watching it happen. There was a battle then above Corvath Prime, and it was the hardest fighting of the entire war. The home fleet of the Dominion was vast and even caught by surprise, even turned the wrong way. It was the most dangerous force we had ever faced. They threw everything they had at us, scrambling ships, recalling patrols, filling the space above their world with desperate defense. We had not come with enough strength to defeat that fleet in open battle, and we had never intended to. We had come to break through it, to reach the world it protected, and to make our point in the one place they could not ignore. The fighting cost us. I will not pretend otherwise, because to pretend otherwise would dishonor the people who paid the price. We lost good ships in that sky and good crews, men and women who had crossed an entire empire through the dark and would never see home again. I watched a frigate captain by a young officer named Clara Bishop place her ship directly between the enemy and our flagship, knowing exactly what it would cost her, buying us the seconds we needed to break through. She did not hesitate. None of them hesitated. They had not come this far to hesitate at the end. I think about Clara Bishop often, and about all the others whose names I read aloud later when we were home and safe, and the price could finally be counted. So we drove forward through the heart of their defense, taking losses. I will mourn for the rest of my life. Refusing to stop, refusing to turn until at last the home fleet broke around us, and we burst through into clear space above the throne world itself. Corvath Prime turned below us, vast and ancient and utterly undefended. The center of an empire that had ruled 10,000 worlds for 3,000 years, lying open beneath the guns of a species they had once filed away as a scheduled resource. I could have fired. Every weapon in my fleet was ready. The world that had ordered the harvest of Proxima Verdon, that had removed the Veli for the crime of selling us fuel, that had called my people a resource and meant it, lay defenseless beneath me. There was a part of me, a part that had been cold and steady since the day I watched a green world fall silent, that wanted nothing in the universe more than to give that order. Maya stood beside me, her hand near the controls, waiting. The whole fleet was waiting. The whole galaxy, I think, was waiting, because by then everyone knew we were there. Everyone had seen the impossible happen, and everyone was holding their breath to see what the terrible humans would do now that the monster lay helpless beneath them. I did not give the order to fire. The temptation lasted longer than I have ever admitted to anyone. I stood there with the whole of my grief pressing on my chest. Proxima Verdant and Cinder Reach and Henry Wells and Clara Bishop and the Valley and 40,000 names and 60,000 more. All of it gathered into a single moment with my hand. A breath away from the order that would balance every account at once. No one in the galaxy would have blamed me. Half of humanity would have called it justice. The cold thing that had lived in my chest since the day a green world fell silent told me very clearly and very reasonably to give the order. And then I thought about what Henry had asked me on the last night of his life. Not that we won, that they mattered. And I understood standing there that if I fired, the Corvathi would become exactly like us in the eyes of the galaxy. Two terrible powers who removed worlds, and the difference between Grace Bell's children and the harvest that took them would dissolve forever. The only way to make the dead matter was to be something the Corvathi had never been. The only victory that would last was the one they could never imagine. Open every channel, I said instead. Every Corvathi frequency, every public band, every relay in this system and the next. I want this seen on every world they own. I want the whole empire watching. Maya's hands moved, channels open, all of them. They're all watching Ella. Everyone is watching. And so, with my fleet weapons silent above the heart of the Dominion, I showed them something instead. I broadcast Proxima Verdant. I showed them the recording I had carried for years, the harvest fleet above a human world, the collection arms reaching down, the empty silence afterward. I showed them Grace Bell's class list, the names of her children scrolling slowly past. I showed them the report their commander had filed, calling it a modest yield, recommending the region for regular harvest. I showed them the world, peaceful and gentle. And then I showed them what the Corvti had done to it. And then I showed them my fleet, whole, ready, holding its fire above their defenseless capital. I spoke only once, and I kept it simple, because I had learned long ago that the cruelest thing you can do to an arrogant power is to be brief and to be true. We crossed your entire empire to reach this place, I said, and I let them hear how calm I was because my calm would frighten them more than any rage. We came all this way to show you that we can do to your world exactly what you did to ours. Your defenses did not stop us. Your fleet did not stop us. Nothing stopped us because you never imagined we could be here. Just as you never imagined we could be anything but a field to be cleared. I let that settle across 10,000 worlds. And now that we are here with your capital beneath our guns and nothing left to protect it, we are choosing not to fire. Look carefully. Remember this moment exactly as it is. We could end your world right now, and we are choosing not to. You harvested ours and called it a modest yield. We are holding yours in our hands, and we are giving it back. Remember both halves of that sentence forever, because your children's children will still be trying to understand the difference between your people and mine. Because the silence on the channels was the silence of an entire empire that did not know what to do. Because nothing in 3,000 years had prepared it for mercy from a power it had wronged. This is not generosity, I told them. Do not mistake it for weakness. The way you mistook our quiet for surrender. This is a promise. We keep our promises. That is the one thing about us you failed to learn, and it is the only thing that ever mattered. So here is our last promise, and you will want to write it down. Surrender. End this war. Sign a peace and honor every border, every treaty, every promise you make from this day forward. Do that, and we will leave your world exactly as it is, turning and whole and full of your people. Refuse and we will return, and there will be no charts left math to map, and no dark left to hide in, because we will already know the way. I let the broadcast hold a moment longer on the image of my silent fleet above their helpless world. Then I closed the channel, and I waited for an empire of 3,000 years to decide whether it wished to continue existing. The waiting was its own kind of battle. My fleet held above their world, weapons silent, while below us and around us the most powerful military force in the galaxy decided what to do. They still had the strength to try to destroy us. Even broken and surprised. The home fleet that remained could have turned and thrown itself at us in one last desperate effort. And if they had, many of us would not have gone home. Maya stood beside me through every minute of it, watching their fleet, watching for the first sign that they had chosen pride over survival. Their holding position, she murmured hour after hour, still holding. They haven't decided. And then much later, in a voice I will never forget, Ara, their weapons are powering down. All of them across the whole system. They're standing down. I have commanded in many tense moments. Nothing has ever matched the silence on my command deck. As 3,000 human beings watched the guns of an empire go cold one by one and understood that they had lived, that it had worked, that the impossible thing was done. No one cheered. We were all too tired and too aware of who was not there to see it. We simply stood in that silence together above a world we had chosen not to harm and let ourselves believe that the war was ending. The Corvathi surrendered within the day. They had no choice that they could see, and in truth, they were right that they had none. We had broken the one thing their entire empire was built upon, the belief that the heart could never be touched. And once that belief was gone, there was nothing left to fight for. They signed the peace we offered. We named it the Accords of Verdant, after the world where it all began, so that every time a Corvathi official put pen to that document, they would have to write the name of the place they had once called a modest yield. I insisted on one more thing in those accords, a clause that the Corvathi negotiators found strange, and that even some of my own people thought unnecessary. I required that the full registry of Proxima Verdant, all 40,000 names, be entered into the permanent records of the Corvathi Dominion, and read aloud once in full before their leadership by their own officials. It took most of a day to read them all. I was told that the reading was a quiet, terrible thing, that the Corvathi officials grew paler with each hour, that some of them could not meet the eyes of the others by the end. Grace Bell's class list was among those names. The children she had asked me to remember were spoken aloud at the heart of the empire that had taken them by the descendants of the people who had ordered it. That was the only payment I ever demanded for myself. Not territory, not tribute. Only that they say the names once and know what they had done. I brought my fleet home through ordinary space openly through the front of their empire that they no longer had the will to close against us. We had gone in through the dark like thieves. We came out in daylight like something the galaxy had decided very suddenly not to argue with. But the title of this story is not about the day the Corvathi surrendered. The surrender was only the beginning of the end. The true ending, the reason their empire never recovered, came slowly over the years that followed. And it came not from anything we did to them, but from what we had shown them about themselves. An empire of 3,000 worlds had ruled through fear, and fear has one fatal weakness. It only works as long as no one has seen it fail. For 3,000 years, no smaller species had ever seen the Corvathi beaten, and so the fear held, perfect and complete. But we had not merely beaten them. We had beaten them above their own capital, in front of every world they owned. And then we had spared them. And the contrast between their cruelty and our restraint had been broadcast to every species in the galaxy, on every channel they possessed. You cannot rule through fear once your subjects have watched you beg. You cannot demand obedience as the strong once everyone has seen you spared as the helpless. The smaller species of the galaxy had spent 3,000 years telling themselves that the Corvathi were too powerful to resist. We had stood above Corvith Prime and proven where all of them could see that this was simply not true. The collapse did not come as a war. It came as a quiet, unstoppable departure. The client species began to leave, not in a sudden uprising, but in a slow and dignified withdrawal, one world at a time. A trading league declared its independence, and the Corvathi, broken and exhausted, did not have the will to stop it. A shipbuilding people stopped sending their vessels to the Dominion. A mining culture closed its borders. Each departure made the next one easier because each one proved again that the monster could no longer enforce its will. The Thari were among the first to declare themselves free. The same people whose elder had brought me 1,000 years of records across the dark. I received word of it on a quiet evening. A simple message with no request attached, no plea for protection, no offer of tribute. It was only an announcement sent to me as a courtesy. After 1,000 years, the elder wrote, "We have remembered that we were a people before the Corvathi came, and we intend to be a people after they are gone. We thank you. We will not need anything further." That last line meant more to me than any victory parade. They did not need us. They were simply free, and they wished us to know it. Oh, that was exactly the galaxy I had hoped to build. One where the small and the frightened did not trade one master for another, but simply stood up on their own feet in their own light. Within a decade, the Dominion that had held 10,000 systems held barely 1,000. Within a generation, it was a minor regional power, one of many, no longer feared, no longer obeyed, remembered mostly as a warning about what happens to the proud. We never fired a shot in that long unwinding. We did not need to. We had done all the work that mattered in a single afternoon above their capital. When we chose not to fire and let the whole galaxy watch us choose, humanity could have taken the empire that the Corvathi let fall. There were voices that argued for it. Voices that pointed out how easily we could step into the space the Dominion was leaving. How naturally the frightened smaller species might accept a new master who had proven itself stronger than the old one. I argued against those voices with everything I had, and so did Admiral Caldwell, and in the end, humanity chose a different road. I want to be honest that the argument was real and that it was not foolish. The strongest voice for Empire belonged to a respected admiral named Walter Brink, a man who had served well in the war and who loved humanity fiercely, and whose reasoning I could not simply dismiss. He stood before the assembled leadership of all human worlds and made his case plainly. The galaxy is frightened and leaderless, he said. If we do not fill that space, something worse will. There will be a new Corvathi one day somewhere, and the small species will bow to it just as they bowed before. Because that is what they have always done. We have the strength now. We have the trust now. If we take up the burden of order, we can prevent the next 3,000 years of fear before it begins. To walk away is not mercy. It is the abandonment of every world that just looked to us for protection. It was a good argument made by a good man, and I have thought about it many times in the years since. I stood and answered him, and I have never spoken words I believed more deeply. Walter is right that something must fill the space the Corvathi leave, I said. He is wrong about what it should be. The Corvathi did not begin as monsters. They began 3,000 years ago, as a strong people who believed they could hold the galaxy together better than anyone else, who believed their strength gave them the duty to rule. Every word my friend just spoke, the Corvathi spoke first, and meant just as sincerely. That is how the monster is made, not from cruelty. From a strong people, certain they know best, who decide that order is worth a little fear. If we take their empire, we will not prevent the next Corvathi. We will become it. Perhaps not in my lifetime, perhaps not in my grandchildren's. But the road that ends in a harvest fleet above a colony begins exactly where Walter wishes us to step. I will not take that first step. I watched where it leads. The room was silent for a long time. Walter Brink looked at me, and to his eternal credit, he did not argue further. He simply nodded slowly, the way an honest man does when he has been shown something he cannot unsee. The vote was not even close. Humanity chose the other road. We did not build an empire. We built something the galaxy had never seen and did not know how to name. We became the species that showed up when a border was wronged. We became the promise that every small and frightened people could quietly rely on. The answer to a question they had never before been able to ask, which was simply, is there anyone who will stand up for us? There was now. There was us. We asked for no tribute, and we claimed no worlds, and the galaxy slowly came to understand that the most powerful species it had ever produced did not want to rule it. It only wanted to keep its promises. It was tested, of course. A promise that is never tested is only a story. A few years after the war, a rising power on the far side of the galaxy decided that the lesson of the Corvathi did not apply to them, and they pushed across the border of a small neighbor who had signed an agreement with us. They expected us to be far away and slow to care. We were neither. A single human squadron arrived at that border within days, not to conquer, not to take, but simply to stand there between the strong and the weak, and to make it clear that the agreement would be honored. There was no battle. There did not need to be one. The rising power looked at the human ships, remembered what had happened to an empire of 10,000 worlds, and withdrew. The small neighbor remained free. We asked them for nothing. We simply went home. After that, no one tested the promise again for a very long time, and the galaxy grew quietly, steadily, more peaceful, in the shadow of a strength that had proven it would not be used for conquest. That is the true reason the Corvathi never recovered. Not because we removed them, we did not. We left them their capital and their people and their lives. They never recovered because we had offered the galaxy a different way to be strong. And once the galaxy had seen that way, it could never again be ruled by the old way of fear. The Corvathi had built their entire existence on the threat of what they could do to you. We had built ours in one broadcast above their world, on the promise of what we would not do, and the second proved stronger than the first. There is a thing I have come to understand in my old age that I did not understand during the war, and I will set it down here because it is the heart of everything. Fear is a debt. Every time you make someone afraid in order to control them, you borrow against a day when they will no longer be afraid, and that day always comes. The Corvathi borrowed for 3,000 years, and they believed, because the day had never come, that it never would. But the debt was always there, growing quietly under the surface of their empire. In every world that obeyed them while hating them, in every species that bowed while remembering, we did not destroy the Korvathi. We simply called in 3,000 years of debt all at once in a single afternoon by proving the day had finally arrived. The empire did not fall because we were strong. It fell because it had always been bankrupt, and we were merely the ones who opened the books. I am an old woman now. The war is 60 years behind me, and most of the people I have spoken of in this account are gone. Maya Foster became an admiral herself, and served with great honor before she passed, and I think of her every day. Ruth Caldwell lived long enough to see the new galaxy take shape and died content. Daniel Carter, who stood beside me on Threshold Station on the worst day of my life, grew old and surrounded by grandchildren. And that is a victory I treasure more than any battle. And Henry Wells, who held the line at Cinder Reach and told me to finish what I started, has been gone for 60 years. And I have tried every day of those 60 years to deserve the thing he died believing I could become. I went back to Proxima Verdant once, many years after the war, when I was already old. The world is settled again now by new families who know its history and honor it. There is a school there, the largest building in the first new town, and it carries Grace Bell's name. I stood in its yard and watched children play, who would never have existed if we had decided on that terrible day that our treaties were only paper. A young teacher there did not know who I was. She told me proudly that the children all learned the old class list by heart every year, so that the names are never lost. I did not tell her my name. I only thanked her, and I wept a little where she could not see. And I understood at last that this and not the battle above the throne world was the thing we had truly won. Not an empire defeated, a schoolyard full of children speaking the names of the dead in a place where the dead had once been taken. Henry had asked me to make sure they mattered. Standing in that yard, I knew that they did. The historian who has asked me to record all this is Korvathi. That is not a detail I have saved for effect. It is simply true, and it is the best proof I can offer, that the galaxy we built was worth the price we paid for it. A young Korvathi scholar sits across from me now, the descendant of the very empire that once called my people a resource, and asks me with real and respectful curiosity to explain my species to her, because her people still whisper our name 3 generations later, and she wishes to understand why. She told me when she first arrived that her own grandfather had served in the home fleet above Corvith Prime on the day my ships came out of the dark. He had been a young officer then, at his station, certain he was about to die. Certain the terrible humans would end his world as his world had ended so many others, and then the humans had not. He had watched our guns stay silent. He had watched our broadcast the green world and the class list and the held fire, and he had spent the rest of his long life trying to understand what kind of a people would cross an empire for revenge and then refuse to take it. He raised his children on that question. One of them raised her, and now she has crossed the same distance in peace to ask it of me directly. There is no monument to the war that means more to me than that single fact that the grandchild of a Korvathi officer can sit safely in my home and ask me to explain mercy. She has asked me a final question, and it is a good one. She wants to know what humans truly are. Are we warriors? She asks the great fighters who crossed an empire and humbled it in a single afternoon. Or are we peacemakers? The species that held its fire above a defenseless world and chose to give it back. I have thought about her question for a long time before answering, because I want to get it right. This account may outlive me, and I would like the last thing I say to be true. We are neither. I tell her we were never warriors, not really. Though we learned to fight better than anyone, because our home world and our own history left us no other choice. And we were never peacemakers. Not in the gentle way her people once imagined peacemakers to be. We are something simpler than either and far more dangerous. And your empire learned what it was at terrible cost. We are a promise-keeping species, that is all. That is everything. Your people wronged our territory once long ago and decided we were too small to matter. And the reason your empire never recovered is not that we destroyed it because we did not. The reason is that on the day you wronged us, we made certain promises to our dead, to ourselves, and in the end, even to you. And then we kept every single one of them. Exactly. Without exception for as long as it took. That is the whole secret. There was never anything more to it than that. We simply meant what we said. Remember that. I tell the young historian, and she writes it down with great care. Tell your people, tell your children, the humans are not the species that can hurt you. The galaxy is full of species that can hurt you. The humans are the species that will keep their word. In the end, that turned out to be the most powerful thing in all the stars.